Hello and what is up YouTube? My name is G3Iron and today we are making some wild predictions saying that everything is prepped for POE 2. Yes, that's right. In my humble opinion, G3Iron, I think that pretty much everything since Exile Con that has been announced and that has been integrated into Path of Exile's core gameplay are all components that are leading towards what will eventually be POE 2 or the 4.0 expansion. For those of you who are new to the channel, you can of course like, subscribe, and ding the bell to be notified about future wacky predictions and discussions just like this one. And down below my geriatric beard, there are some timestamps for your convenience using YouTube chapters that you can jump forward or jump backwards in time and revisit any of the hilarious and simply crazy predictions that we make today. Our hypothesis for today's discussion is as follows. First off, everything Grinding Gear Games has been doing since planning for POE 2 began has been foundational for implementing POE 2. So everything they've been planning presently and in the past building up to POE 2, and as soon as they knew about POE 2, everything has been building up and planned to be integrated and incorporated into POE 2 in some way. All this means is that as they're designing something presently prior to POE 2's implementation, they're thinking that it's going to be around when POE 2 comes out, so they're probably planning and thinking about ways to integrate the gameplay of whatever it is that they're designing pre-POE 2 into a world post-POE 2. Therefore, based on that, if that is true, then our best guesses as what is yet to come in POE 2 is to look back at what has been implemented into the core of Path of Exile, probably dating back to sometime around ExileCon, maybe before that, because POE 2 of course has been in the works for a lot longer time than just last year, but nonetheless, that gives us a rough vantage point to at least start our discussion of what is going into the core of Path of Exile presently and what to expect coming into Path of Exile 2. So, without any further ados or without any further hypotheses, here are 5 predictions about how everything that has been going on over the last year is prepped for POE 2. A long time ago, in a galaxy far away, Path of Exile 3.7 Legion League came out. Now, how does Legion League point us towards what we think might be coming down the road in POE 2? Firstly, I think that timeless jewels that have oftentimes nowadays been moved onto the passive tree, by the way, I think that timeless jewels in general are giving us a glimpse into what Grinding Gear Games is going to do with the passive tree moving into POE 2. I think that not only do timeless jewels essentially allow us to vol our passive tree or flip our passive tree over. If it was a board game, there would be a hidden side to a second side of a particular board. I think that's where we're headed with timeless jewels, that they essentially will unlock a secondary purpose or a secondary screen, as it were, of passives that allow us to unlock totally new gameplay options. Now, while timeless jewels were a relatively small test basis of this, I think that POE 2 is actually pointing towards an entirely overlapping and new passive tree. It really doesn't make much sense when you think about passive trees being designed that there would be one passive tree that is available if you play through the Path of Exile 2 campaign, and then one passive tree that is available to you if you play through the Path of Exile 1 campaign. That doesn't make much sense. What makes much more sense is if there is one passive tree that is accessible in different ways and at different points in time and in different manners, depending on which of the 2 story campaigns that are going to be available once POE 2 comes out. And once that release comes live, there will be some sort of a melding together of these, what could be 2 separate passive trees into a single passive tree that you can access in 2 different ways. One of those ways, I think, could be through, of course, timeless jewel implementation, simply socketing something into the passive tree that allows you to interact with a new version or an altered version or a voled version or a vol state or some sort of altered state of the passive tree. That would be a temporary passive tree that would be accessible only through the use of an item interacting with it. Of course, that other option, a more permanent passive tree, could still be there, but I think that timeless jewels give us an indicator that it's more going to be a temporary or overlapping sort of system rather than 2 separate passive tree systems altogether. Then again, I've been wrong before, and I'll be wrong again. Legion also gave us the 5-way fight, which gave us new map devices and a new power level of access to maps and to the way that we interact with our maps and with fragments as well. Prior to Legion's introduction of the 5-way fight, we always thought of the map device as being something that retained 4 different separate spots. You could put any sort of fragments, or now scarabs, of course, or different augmenting currencies that would change your map encounter. Nowadays, of course, now that we've got the 5-way encounter, thanks to Legion League, there are 5 spots that are available. Does this mean that someday we will have a 5-way encounter that will access and augment previously available editions of fights, including the Pale Court, Adziri, Uber Adziri, Shaper, as well as the Elder and Uber Elder? These are all fights that are based off of 4 fragments, and it could be in the future with Path of Exile 2 that we see that 5-component map device integrated into a more fuller concept where there's a whole bunch of content that GGG has already designed but is now going to ramp up through the use of a 5th fragment of some sort. I think this could be a hint that Legion paved the way for a new sort of Uber mapping system that will come into play later on in the future of Path of Exile 2. It was the best of times and it was the worst of times. Those of you who remember Blight League 3.8. Well, how is it that Blight League is pointing towards what the future of Path of Exile will be in POE 2? I think there are at least 2 ways that Blight is pointing us towards what the future will look like. First off, it's with oils. Oils have introduced in Path of Exile interactions between the passive tree and our gear. Now, while we've had gear in the past that of course are items and you can interact with them on your character like abyssal jewels or just regular jewels, items that you find that you then socket into your tree, we've had those before. But what Blight has introduced is a currency that you can then spend onto your gear spots that will then unlock different parts of the passive tree that you otherwise didn't have to spend passive points to achieve. This could mean that Blight is pointing towards or was a test case for currency that would allow you to interact with the passive tree overall. Now, the economics of Blight League were very, very interesting because for the first time in Path of Exile history, we had a direct correlation between a tradable currency and particular passive nodes. Because there were specific recipes to hit specific nodes, we now had an economic value that could be placed on different particular nodes on different parts of the passive tree. Depending on any given meta, different particular oils are of course in higher demand or lower demand, but we now have an economic value that is attached to the passive tree through the currency that was introduced in Blight thanks to oils. There's a lot of potential here, not just through oils, but also potentially through that system that could be introduced through Legion League, where we might have 2 overlapping sort of hidden passive trees, one that's activated through item usage, or maybe even a permanent passive tree, a secondary passive tree, in addition to our ascendancy trees, which could be activated through other currency items like oils. Not oils themselves, but something like oils that is a currency item that will drop, is acquirable, and then you can use it to acquire different power on a different passive tree. Who knows? Maybe this is the solution and the long-term idea for replacing the labyrinth. We don't know, but we do know that Blight is most likely pointing towards something with the implementation of oils. Blight also introduced this really cool mechanic where you essentially take on Blight-only maps. And it was very, very interesting because, of course, when you first entered a Blight map for your very first time, you walked around and wanted to kill some monsters, and there were no monsters there, not until you started the encounter. Blight introduced a way in which you can interact with a permanently influenced map of a particular content type. In other words, Blight introduced maps on steroids for player-targeted content. Now, while scarabs have been hailed as an ingenious enablement and empowerment of player choice, and I firmly believe that, I think that Blights took it even another step further with the introduction of Blight maps. Imagine for just a moment if you could influence an entire map with, let's say, Delirium. Oh wait, you can do that. Thanks to, of course, Blight's early on implementation. Imagine now if we could do that for every single league type that we wanted. Maybe there's an indicator here or a hint that the 10% chance to encounter a particular master or a particular type of content is going the way of the dodo bird, and maybe we'll have a bit more player agency as we move forward, where players can essentially influence a particular type of map to have the current content that that player wants on that particular map in order to encounter the various sorts of monsters that they want to interact with. Then again, maybe this is all just wishful thinking, and maybe Blight maps are just Blight maps and they're not an indicator of anything else. Although I think Delirium maps already point us towards that. But more on Delirium in just a moment. In a hole in the ground, there lived a Metamorph. Do you guys remember Metamorph 3.9 League? Well, what can we learn about PoE 2 from Metamorph 3.9? A couple of things. First off, PoE 2 is going to introduce a whole slew of new monsters and of new bosses. This means that if Metamorph is going to get any sort of revamp or any sort of update in line with previous bosses and now bringing them into the modern era of Path of Exile 2, it means that we'll have more customizable monsters to be able to go and visit Tane in his laboratory and then kill those monsters in all sorts of gruesome and delicious ways. So there's the potential for new monsters and new boss combinations, but that also means there's the potential for new reward types that would be associated with Metamorph. Speaking of reward types, remember how catalysts were introduced in Metamorph? Catalysts sometimes go under the radar as an introduction or as a new piece of content that came along with Metamorph. Most people, when they think of Metamorph, I know this isn't you guys. You guys are all well educated and think totally, knowing exactly where every piece of content has ever come from. But some people don't remember that catalysts were introduced with Metamorph and allowed you to up quality on very specific items which previously were not available to have quality placed on them, namely rings and amulets. Metamorph could have been a test case scenario for further improving quality on items that would then branch out or have specific targetable improvements upon items. For instance, at the moment, you can improve quality on armor or on a weapon using the various currency items that are associated with those particular item slots. But imagine if you could target specific mods, very specific, ultra specific, if you could reduce the RNG of what it is that you are improving with simply improving the quality on a base item and improve something different. Imagine if you could improve a health roll on a weapon. I don't know why you would want to do that, but imagine if you could. Imagine if you could improve the damage roll or the critical strike roll on an explodey chest piece that's got attacks or spell crit. Improving a particular piece of gear through targeted improvement of the quality of a piece of gear is something that Metamorph introduced to us, and I think it's something that we may see in the future with Path of Exile 2. It would give players a lot more access to already current stats available in the game that could then be augmented or rather further empowered through the introduction of core principles that were originally introduced through Metamorph League and Catalysts. It was a bright, cold day in April, and the clocks were striking Delirium. What can we learn from Delirium as we look forward to Path of Exile 2? I think Delirium might give us the most amount of an overview of what's going on with Path of Exile 2, both in terms of mechanics as well as in terms of system improvements and AI overhauls. Delirium introduced for us a whole bunch of new specters, like literally hundreds of new specters. I think this was an indicator that the dev team was at work, hard at work, on updating various behaviors for monsters that are then going to also be introduced not only in Delirium for Spectre usage, but in Path of Exile 2 in general, both for us to kill as well as for us, hopefully, to be able to raise as Spectres. So we had monster AI improvements. We also, of course, had visual improvements, and then we also had act towns being used as various endgame encounters. Now, you've got to admit, entering into an act town for an endgame boss encounter through the simulacrum was pretty awesome. I don't know if you guys remember your first run through on a simulacrum. For me, it was the Act 3 or Act 7 version of the town. It was Sarn, and it was really, really cool to see as you ran around the town killing monsters in an environment where you typically cannot use any of your abilities, you cannot spam your flasks, and now you're in an endgame encounter where you're really hoping you don't die because you've only got X number of portals, or you're playing hardcore and you've only got one shot at it. I think this could be an indicator that Path of Exile in general is headed away where there will eventually be every single zone that you can enter will be a zone that you can fight monsters in. Now, this is potentially problematic because we've got a lot of different zones in addition to our towns. For instance, we've got all of our towns, we've got all of our hideouts, we've got the laboratory for Tane, which of course we already can fight some monsters, but then on top of that, we've now got Harvest Gardens, we've also got the Labyrinth, and we've got the Bestiary, and then of course we've got Delve. We've got all of these various side areas, which right now we can't really do much except the League specific stuff that we're already programmed and allowed to do in those areas. I think Delirium is at least testing what it looks like for players to use these already created zones and see what it's like to encounter endgame versions of whatever that zone would be. Essentially, these would be new mapping areas that you reach upon the completion of whatever a simulacrum 300 splinter count is for whatever that particular instance would be. Imagine fighting a boss in the menagerie and you've got to run through all of the various different zookeeper pens. Imagine going into Delve and there's some sort of influenced area that you've got to run through and there's several different biomes that you have to approach and attack. Or imagine if in some sort of weird updated version of the labyrinth, you've got Delirium running through the labyrinth itself. And not only do you have a timer going on in the background of, let's say, Delirium lasting, but what if that zone in and of itself like actually became fatal after the Delirium wore off? Talk about trying to speed run through the lab. Now that is what I call layers of RNG with layers of stress. Delirium introduced having this visual effect that took over the entirety of a screen without having to go through a loading screen, whether it was Alva and her temple instances, which had the mini loading screen, or whether that was an Abyssal Depths that took you through a loading screen to a new area. Grinding Gear Games is no stranger to designing lead content that requires you to jump into another zone in order to interact with it. But we're seeing more and more that Grinding Gear is getting better at presenting lead content without having to force us to go through different loading zones. Now you might say, well, Iron, we've always had stuff like ambush boxes or torment ghosts or even something like Breach where we didn't necessarily have to travel to another zone. And you're right about that, but the amount of content that is being packed and the amount of monsters that is being packed into a zone simply by triggering Delirium, I think is an indicator of something that is to come, that the visual effects that were put on display and put as a test with Delirium were just a foretaste of what is yet to come with Path of Exile 2, with different areas being influenced through new league content in a similar way through Delirium Fog. Now we just have to hope that whatever that new league content isn't themed in such a way that it's gray on top of black on top of another shade of gray. Now, I mentioned earlier how Blight maps allow us to target specific content, and Delirium orbs allow us to do this already in a lot of different ways. If you're looking for a particular type of drop, you just simply need to influence your map with a Delirium orb of that particular type of drop, and you're guaranteed to have that reward type at least be present on the map that you encounter. I think that Delirium and Blight are pointing towards a new way in which we as the players, target the type of content that we want to target in a way that is more targetable and that is less random than daily masters missions. We will always have daily master missions, I think, as we move forward into Path of Exile 2. But I think with Blight map implementation and Delirium orb implementation, we are moving towards an era in Path of Exile where the endgame atlas really is going to be pick your poison and choose what sort of content you want to interact with. Because there's simply so much content available in Path of Exile right now that unless GGG either drops and cuts a whole bunch of stuff that people might enjoy and interact with, or they allow it to be targetable, and there's a whole new blossoming economy of players interacting with the content that they want to interact with in a targeted and very profitable and enjoyable way. All this happened more or less during Harvest League. What does Harvest 3.11 have to show us about Path of Exile 2? Without any drumroll or further ado, I simply think that harvest crafting is going to be the future of Path of Exile. I'll give you a moment. Some of you are going to be angry about that. Some of you are going to be rejoicing. So do whatever it is that you need to do without waking up your neighbor, roommate, children, or friends, or coworkers who are asleep. Wait, we're all socially distanced. Nobody's actually at work right now. Okay, did you take your moment? All right, now that you've cheered or shouted or screamed or whatever, I genuinely think that Path of Exile 2 is being designed with everything right now in mind. This means that harvest crafting and all of the joys, all of the ups, all of the downs of it are all going to be pointing towards what crafting is going to look like in Path of Exile 2. We already have confirmation all the way back at ExileCon that fusings are going the way of the dodo bird. They're on the way out in terms of Path of Exile design for the future. That is a staple currency inside Path of Exile that has been around for ages. And if you would have told me 2 years ago that fusings are going the way of the dodo bird, I would have scratched my head and said, how? How are they going to do that? How are they going to manage to change something that is so paramount to the entire crafting system and gameplay system of Path of Exile as fusings and links? The answer, of course, is that links aren't going away, but fusings, the way you achieve them, are going away. I think that's what's happening in the preview that we're being given here with Harvest League. Harvest crafting will be the new era of Path of Exile crafting in POE 2, in that as much that can be deterministically crafted will be deterministically crafted. This doesn't mean that there's going to necessarily be a new level of power that is added to the game, but rather that this will be a power level that is currently available, will become more accessible to more players because everybody can SSF, solo self-found, and craft their own gear. Oftentimes, players are afraid to craft their own gear using their currency as they are leveling up, simply because you don't want to use currency on a base that you know is going to be going bye-bye in a few levels as you progress on to the next act. What Harvest does is it forces you to use whatever craft it is that you've got available in your garden in the present moment, because that craft is going away. Rather than saying save your currency because your item is going away, now it's your currency is going away, so you might as well use it on your crafting. This is a design that is a massive shift in terms of the player economy in Trade League, and it's also a massive, massive shift in design space for the simplicity or complexity of Path of Exile. Oftentimes, players wouldn't get into super high-end crafting because it simply costs too much. There were too many elements of RNG, layers and layers of RNG, to quote Chris Wilson, on top of one another in order to craft anything of value or of high value in Path of Exile. I recognize that value is a relative term, but for the sake of the discussion, just stick with me. If you wanted to craft something in Path of Exile using traditional currency, it would cost more than what it costs presently through the Harvest League. Now, Harvest League has introduced deterministic crafting in a way that is more accessible to players than RNG crafting ever used to be. This new system, if it is well received by the design team, we already know what most players think about Harvest, whether or not they're for it or against it. But if this is well received by the design team at Path of Exile at Grinding Gear Games, then it's sticking around, and I think this is a preview of what crafting is to come in PoE 2. Again, go lament or scream or shout for joy or for hatred. Either way, I think this is what's coming down the line. The second thing that I think Harvest previews for us is that Harvest actually addresses some of the problems of item bloat. So right now, players are looking for all kinds of currency and bases to be able to craft on. With Harvest, really what you're looking for is you're looking for your ideal base in a particular item slot for your character, and then you're simply looking to farm and craft on that particular base. You don't necessarily need to have any sort of other items drop for you once you've got your best in slot base. You might not have that best in slot base perfectly crafted in its rare iteration for you, but as long as you've got the base, you can be working towards it through Harvest crafting. We already know from presentations at ExileCon and at other conferences and interviews that Grinding Gear Games has item bloat as a very serious problem that they are trying to address. They want less stuff populating as you kill stuff, they want less of a loot pinata effect, and more of the things that drop to be things that you actually consider looting, looking at, and then using for your own character. One way to do this is to open up the Pandora's box that is deterministic player crafting, which allows players to simply pick up whatever it is that they'd like for their particular build and then begin crafting on it ASAP. Rather than needing to farm or trade for hours on end in order to acquire currency to then throw it into the RNG slot machine that was traditional crafting in Path of Exile, now as players you can interact with content as you deterministically craft your best in-slot items. That solves a bunch of item bloat issues, including populating the game with a bunch of worthless items. There won't be worthless items anymore because, simply put, bases that drop are either useful and will show up on people's loot filters, or they'll be judged unuseful, and game designers overall at Grinding Gear Games will go, these bases aren't being used and we need to go back and rework them. We've seen this take place multiple times throughout the last year, as there have been reworks for casters, for self-casting, for automated casting, for minions, as well as now for two-handers, and of course the infamous Bow League. We've seen that GGG is willing to go back and take a look at item bases and look at the scope and the space of where particular items are at, and I think this is all leading towards where Harvest is pointing, which is a revamp of the entire crafting system and an eventual solution to item bloat. Well, thanks so much for joining us for today's discussion. I look forward to hearing your thoughts down below in the comments about all of this wonderful stuff and all of these crazy predictions that are sure to go wrong about Path of Exile 2. What are your predictions about Path of Exile 2? Do you have particular insights or particular theories about different league content that you think is shaping or pointing the way towards Path of Exile 2? Drop us a comment down below. Also, let us know what are your theories about current league mechanics and how those league mechanics will either continue in the core edition of Path of Exile 2 or be re-implemented through new league mechanics coming in PoE 2. Big shout out to all of our Patreon supporters, and I hope today is the day a Mirror of Calandra drops for you.
Thanks for watching that video. If you'd like more information on any of our discussion points today, you can see them down below in the video description. If you'd also like to join our Discord or support our Patreon, you can do so with the links down below. Thanks again, and big shout out to all of our Patreon supporters.